Prof, I think we can start if we, as soon as Sikonati arrives, then we can just introduce him again.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome everyone to our first webinar series called Pitsos. As many will know, a Pitso is a gathering of members of a community to discuss a burning issue. For this particular Pitso, we're discussing yesterday's budget presentation. A word of thank you to our panelists, Mr. Kaya Setole, Mr. Sikonati Manchancha, and Mr. Ray Mahlaka for availing yourself to this session. The session will be facilitated by Professor Peter Krokramp, and over to you, and all the best for the day.
Thank you very much, Prof. Joseph. To my guest, I hope Sikonati will surface soon. But I have here with me Kaya Setole. He's been a guest with our program before, and we've invited him for that very reason, because we think he has a very peripheral understanding, in the sense that he sees the big picture of South African politics together with the economics. Then we have Ray Mahlaka from the Daily Maverick. I just read your article. I will ask you a little bit about that, but I think you've shown the insights that we will need today. And then as soon as Sikonati Manchancha joins us, he's from News 24, business journalist. I will introduce him again with you. I would like to start. I'm always very surprised that somehow, even during the state capture years, the ministers of finance managed to read a budget that do not offend the markets. In fact, Kaya, this budget has been well received by international markets, as well as by the media. The rand is strengthened from 1882 to 1891. How is it possible, given our high unemployment, exorbitant debt levels, low economic growth, high inflation, relatively high interest rates, general lack of trust in our systems of governance? What am I missing? Why is it that it seems like the finance minister still instills a degree of trust with his budget year after year?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me, Pete. If you can't, please let me. So I do think that in reality, for the better part of the past decade, we've really been dealing with budgets of low expectations. And what makes it a budget of low expectations is that anyone who would have been anticipating yesterday's budget was not really anticipating the ambitious, but simply trying to work out how the government was going to manage what little it has and how it contains the damage associated with the position of where we are. So if you look at some of the positive reactions do not emanate from being the budget that turns around South Africa's economic fortunes. But it's a budget that says that, well, actually, guess what? We need much more money than we did before. But instead of having to borrow that and make the position much worse, we found this particular windfall, which is probably more accidental rather than strategic, which is 150 billion rand. A couple of years ago, the similar accidental windfall came from the commodities boom, which meant that, commodities companies had much more to offer in the way of taxes. So the positive reaction is simply a matter of a sigh of relief on the basis that he didn't have to go and sign up for more debt in order to be able to balance the books. So that's where I think the positive sentiment came from. It is also inevitable that in an election year, the anxieties around how far they would go and really just going for broke, no pun intended, is always a question of serious anxieties. And obviously, when you are going to manage an election program, you have to be able to balance what the political fallout of difficult decisions might be versus the practical realities that you're facing. So the political fallout of increasing taxes, for example, is remarkably catastrophic in an election year. So I did not anticipate that the minister would do something like that. It would have been remarkably stupid politically to even countenance something like that. But we all walked in knowing that we need to find the money somewhere. And what you then saw is that for many weeks ahead of the budget, they actually started manipulating or massaging the public opinion, in that of the 60 million citizens, I probably can tell you only a handful, if even that, knew that there was that particular fund that the Reserve Bank which has now been tapped into. So what you saw was a strategic leaking of the awareness of that information long beforehand, so that people could sort of come to the idea that there is this particular reserve fund and it's a particular reserve fund that may occasionally be tapped into. So when it then came through yesterday, then it was a matter of, oh, well, they've identified the low-hanging fruit and they've exploited it, rather than actually going for something even more radical. So it's actually a reaction based on low expectations, rather than everybody saying, dear God, this is the budget that turns around the country's fortunes.
But Kaya, you said something which I didn't see. You said that the budget had something to do with the election. Which part of the budget you think had anything to do with the election?
Well, there's a couple of elements.
It was aimed at massaging the public opinion with the election in mind.
So the first issue, for example, relates to the question of the social wage. And I think everyone understands that the social wage, which is obviously made up of a combination of the grant system and some of the more indirect transfers that the government makes to citizens, that is taking up an enormous part of the budget alongside the interest costs that you have to pay. So when you look at how big that social wage is, the more difficult decision that a minister would have to take is to say, well, actually, here's what we're doing in order to reduce that social wage. In other words, getting less citizens to be reliant on the state, for example. And of course, in an election year, that would simply mean that if they had said we have to do this, it's a question of, well, how do you change the means test, for example, in order to have less people qualifying for a particular grant? So you saw over the past couple of years, they've been tinkering with the social relief of distress grant, for example, in order to actually reduce the number of people that qualify for it. So the fact that yesterday you did not have any conversations around, well, you did say this was a temporary relief measure. It was a temporary relief measure that came through at the heart of COVID. So does it have a permanent end date? And if not, what is the actual long-term response to that? So rather than tackling that and risking alienating people, they simply stayed away from the conversation. And if you were sitting in the assembly yesterday, you'd have noticed that the biggest round of applause actually came in when the minister then said, in relation to the traditional grants, which is, the baseline of the grants, there's an increase of 100 Rand. And of course, when that sounds like, the type of thing that is going to appeal to the many people that are reliant on that particular system, that is a type of statement that says, actually, we are taking care of you. And remember, you need us to remain in government in order for us to continue taking care of you. So he says that it's 100 Rand, which sounds like a big number in relation to how the grants have been structured. But it's actually in two phases. There's a first phase, I think it's 90 Rand, and then there's 10 Rand later on. But that's not relevant. The issue is that we are increasing your grants by 100 Rand.
Kaya, to be honest, it would have been completely immoral not to, given the inflation rate, given the absolute levels of poverty, completely immoral not to increase that grant, however, with a percentage point of 5 or 6%. To say that it's got aimed at the election, I'm not sure that paints a complete picture. There are so many South Africans who are completely reliant on that. But I'm going to come back to you to that. Ray, you wrote a lovely article in Daily Maverick on this 150 billion Rand that seems to offend my friend Kaya a little bit. Have we used it before? That's the one thing. And the second thing is, I know for a fact that many countries have that reserve fund, which they use from time to time for whatever reason. And I think we've used it for a very good reason. That is to somehow address our debt level. If you want to use it, look, you could have spent. I was wondering why the minister didn't spend some money on Transnet, because that's one way of getting the productive economy going again. If you spent 50 billion on Transnet, I think it would have been a massive investment. But it could be that he doesn't buy into Transnet turnaround plan. But let's just talk about this 150 billion Rand. Is this the first time that South Africa used this fund?
No, not at all. In fact, if you look at history, the last time there was a bit of a withdrawal, I think it was back in 2003. But I want to go back to the market response question that you asked Kaya about why was the markets, we didn't see an adverse reaction to markets. I think a lot of the market response and investors were already conditioned to how worse and constrained the budget is and public finances are. But I think using the 150 billion Rand from the gold and currency contingency reserve to pay down borrowing costs is actually a good thing, because it would have been pernicious if the money was used for consumption measures, such as paying for the public sector wage bill, for example. So paying down the borrowing costs, especially on the debt, which sits at about 5 trillion Rand, and interest alone on that debt is about 350 billion Rand, What that will do is give the government a lot of space to fund other initiatives that might grow the economy, that might, I don't know, stabilize SOEs, mainly Transnet, to a much better path. But to use the funds to pay down debt, it will really go a long way in giving public finances a lot of breathing room.
Yeah, but if you pay debt while you're making debt, does that make sense? Because we increase our debt as well this year.
Yeah. It's a very complex matter, but I think the immediate concern from the Treasury officials and the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, is to really wrestle down those borrowing costs, because the alternative would be to raise further debt in the bond market. What the government does is it issues T-bills, that is, Treasury bills. This is short-term debt on the markets. We have already raised the weekly bond issuances by up to 12 billion rand, and I think the limit is 14 billion rand. The investor community is very wary of giving South Africa money because the risk premium to South Africa, or how investors see South Africa, is quite negative. The economy is not growing fast enough, so a lot of investors are very wary about getting their monies back. So the alternative would be much more dire, raising money in the bond market and also paying quite high interest rates on that debt as well by issuing those bonds. So, I think the government really weighed up the better of two evils, I guess, at this point.
What do you make of the fact that the government is withdrawing that fund immediately and the legislation is not in place yet? I would think that's impossible to do, but apparently they can. But why is that? Why couldn't they get the legislation in place before they do that? Is it illegal to do it now if you don't have the legislation in place to do that?
So what happened yesterday is the finance minister tabled, legislation to create a framework on how to better manage this process. Because I think, whatever legislative mechanisms are being put in place right now will also set the path for future drawdowns. If the government would have to, again, tap into those reserves, there would be, a governance framework and a way of creating the framework of drawing down the funds. But we know as of yesterday that a bill that sets the framework of drawing down those funds has been introduced rather by Parliament. And also, I need to add this. The National Treasury and the Reserve Bank are still working out terms and the mechanisms of drawing down these funds in the reserve account, that is. So it's not yet cast in stone. There's still a long process involved, a legislative process, that is.
Kaya, a friend of mine who in some other way have access to the dark arts of cabinet meetings tells me that the debate on the national health insurance is a vicious one. There's broad support for the national health insurance. The president says, give me my pen, I want to sign this bill. The Minister of Finance in Cabinet made the point, and he's keep on making it in public, and obviously yesterday, or in his speech as well, says there is no money for this. What do you make of this? Is it a stress point in Cabinet? What is the conversation between the President and his Minister of Finance when it comes to this? The one wants to sign the bill, the other one, if you want to introduce a bill, you need a budget for it, I assume.
So the big problem that we have is that obviously what the government wants to be able to do is that it needs to be able to answer a question that its own voter base asks of. You said to us you're going to deliver on these particular promises, on this particular policy directions, and you haven't done so. So the NHI is one example of that. The question of the State Bank is one example of that. And what you've seen in recent weeks is that there's been an acceleration in getting those particular processes over the line. So now it's literally only the president's signature away from being completed. So the fact that the president can say that no, everything has been done procedurally in order to get me to sign simply means that he can answer the question on the campaign trail to say 5 years ago you told us that if you put you into power you're going to deliver on these things, and he should be able to say yes as the NC government will put it together. Now, the reality is that once you sign these things into law, they actually then do need to be funded adequately and they need to be implemented adequately. And in spite of one's wishes, and in spite of the political party's own orientation, the reality is that if the money is not there, the money simply isn't there. So what you saw is that a couple of weeks ago, the president says that all I need is a pen. If somebody hands me a pen, I'm going to sign this into law. So you'd have expected that to have happened, and for the finance minister to then say, because the president is about to sign this into law, if it does so tomorrow or the day after, this is actually what the budget allocation towards the implementation of that is going to be. All we emerged with yesterday was a number of 1.4 billion rand, which obviously has got absolutely nothing to do with the actual rollout of the NHI. It's just to take care of some preliminary admin, so it doesn't get us there. Yeah, so that's the big problem that you find there, right? And then on the other point that you raised earlier on the question of the morality of amending the social grants, the reality is that the morality debate fell apart long ago because the way in which you design the grant system isn't responsive to the question of what does it need for a person who relies on the state to be able to live for a month, for example. So how the design of our social assistance system is that we work out how much money we have and then we divide it by the number of people who qualify. So even yesterday's 100 rand, it wasn't a response to saying that the inflation that affects those grant recipients more acutely is at a particular rate. So therefore, if you increase it by that much, you're insulating them from the fallout. It was simply a matter of how much can we redirect towards those particular resources. And the reason I said that it's politically palatable in an election year is that obviously you will hear this, unfortunately, in the campaign trail, is that ANC politicians will say, you see, we are the people that are protecting the social wage. We are the people that are keenly invested in the social wage. So therefore, please put us back into power. And you're going to hear rhetoric that says that if you dare go for other parties, they may take this away. The president himself has already said this a couple of weeks ago, where he said that the financial aid scheme and the grant system would be at risk if the ANC was taken out of power. So now they've got a license to say, not only are we committed to it, but look at what we did. In trying circumstances, we found a way to support that wage and sacrifice everything else.
Yeah, I see the president in the Sona speech said we pay a grant to 19 million people. He got it wrong. We pay 19 million grants to 12 million people. But Kaya, let me just ask you something else. While me and you seems to have differences in public here, this minister has stopped something which the previous minister did quite well, quite effectively. The previous minister said, I am not going to increase the salary bill any longer. And he went to court and he won that case. Why is Gonongwana giving in a territory that Tito Mboweni already broke open and won over for government?
Well, it actually stems back from why Tito Mboweni could do that. So what had happened is that historically, ahead of elections, the unions have got enormous bargaining power with the ANC because, well, if you don't give us what we want, we're not going to mobilize our masses, whether it's COSATU or NEHAO, all of these particular unions in order to support the ANC. So what used to always happen is that ahead of general elections, there was always this potential tinderbox where if the union said, well, actually, this is what we think we're entitled to, and the ANC said otherwise, there could be a political fallout there. This is what then led us to this idea of multi-year wage agreement. So the multi-year wage agreement is the one that Tito Mboweni then said, well, actually, when this multi-year wage agreement was put into place, circumstances were different. Circumstances are now fundamentally different, and therefore this is no longer affordable. And I think obviously the legal process eventually agreed with Tito Mboweni, but the political process really created particular casualties out of that conversation because there's now a loss of trust between the ANC and the unions about how sacrosanct those agreements are. So what you're now seeing is that rather than simply saying that, well, actually, we are going to pay the civil servants what they want, what you would have heard yesterday from the minister is that there's now this bit of a distinction between the type of civil service which is labor intensive. So he specifically mentions teachers, he specifically mentioned healthcare workers and the police, because we understand that that's where the labor intensive part of the system is. And therefore, in relation to those, then he will specifically say that we are going to protect their earnings potential or their incomes, but it doesn't say it's a blanket approach to the entire civil service, because we also know at the same time that various departments have been told that we are out of money, so start doing something differently with those. So what that would have happened is that if you had spoken to the unions yesterday, the unions that represent those labor-intensive sectors in particular, they would have been very happy with the budget, because I think the number was 57 billion rand that has actually been earmarked to ensure that there isn't a fallout from the question of, well, you've neglected us, you've left us behind. So you're seeing a minister who's responding to the times that we're in. We are heading to a general election. If this had been a post-election budget, perhaps would have had more latitude to say, well, actually, there just isn't enough. So let's work on creating the resources and then putting them together. But right now, he managed to secure the support of the unions with the 57 billion rand allocation.
Ray, you have dipped into that gold and foreign reserves fund for the purpose of Transnet? Because to me, it just makes sense. Would you have done that?
Look, there's no doubt that you can't avoid providing Transnet financial support, given its significance and importance to the economy. But what you are starting to see, I think, is a bit of tough love approach from Godongwana that he promised back in 2021 when he was first appointed as the finance minister. He's now taking a different approach when it comes to the Transnet question. What he said yesterday was, I will only give Transnet further financial support if Transnet and its board shows demonstrable progress in implementing a turnaround to implement the turnaround plan and show reforms in Transnet's rail and port operations. There is a turnaround plan that's in place at Transnet at the moment. It is approved by the Transnet board. It is approved by cabinet.
So where's the money?
Well.
Where's the money then?
And there's no money. And in order to implement that plan, by the way, which involves opening up the rail operations for private sector players to participate, in running trains and also running port terminals. In order to implement that plan, the board of Transnet requires 100 billion rand in financial support from the government through government guarantees, through taking over a portion of Transnet's debt, just like the Eskom debt relief program, by the way, and also injecting a bit of money to shore up Transnet's.
Right, but they have a 47 billion rand government guarantee that they have, I think it's 47 billion, could be more. So we could have cherry picked another 50 billion from this fund and solved the problem of Transnet to some degree at least.
It doesn't solve the problem, by the way, the guarantee. It solves because the guarantee will be used to pay down Transnet's debt and any bonds that come up for maturity. By the way, over the next 3 years, Transnet has about debt worth 50 billion rand that's coming up for maturity. Even a 47 billion rand guarantee is not going to be enough to settle Transnet's debt. So I think what Godongwana is trying to do here to Transnet is to say, stand on your own at the moment, implement reforms, and once I see any positive reforms or progress with that, with those reforms, then we can come back and negotiate for further state support. But Beat, that 47 billion rand.
But he said something else. He said something else, and he said that the state will have to rely on public-private partnerships to address the issue of Transnet. Is he waiting for private sector companies to say, yes, we can take over a particular part of the rail or the ports and we're willing to put up the money? And once you instill that type of trust that there is a degree of investment coming in from the private sector, then you can use that trust to allocate more resources to Transnet. Do you think that's how his headspace is working?
I think so, because also, by the way, the private sector players are very keen to partner with Transnet on the rail and port side. We have seen even the former CEO Portia Derby and Sizam Zabela, the CEO of the freight rail business of Transnet. The private sector over the past 3 years has approached both executives, putting forward proposals on how to partner on the rail and port side, but those CEOs were just not willing to partner with the private sector. By the way, third-party rail access, meaning that the private sector partners with Transnet and participating in the rail side of Transnet business. We are expecting some movement from March this year, so next month. And we'll stop. And I think on the port side, if memory serves, we might have a private sector party that will be announced to partner with Transnet, particularly at the Durban port. So there are a bit of movements from March and June, but I think Godongwana wants to see where reforms will go before even considering a bailout for Transnet.
Where do you get your information? Because I also have my ear to the floor there, but I don't hear this. Where did you get this? Did you read it somewhere, or who told you this?
It's in the budget, by the way. In the budget review on the Transnet portion of the budget review, we are expecting that third-party rail process to start in March. Yeah.
Kaya, there's something else that was also leaked in advance that we also knew is going to happen, and that was the matter of bracket keep. All South Africans think that the taxes haven't been raised, but actually we do pay more taxes because bracket creep hasn't been addressed, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the passive instruments that the government uses to still achieve its outcomes. So in an ordinary year, what the minister should have said was to say, look, last year, these were the tax brackets that we put together. So therefore, if you earn a particular income, then your after-tax cash flow is at a particular level. We do also know that the cost of living has changed. Inflation has been there. So in order to enable you to be able to afford the same amounts of goods that you're able to afford last year, then we need to make sure that your after-tax cash flow position is slightly better by adjusting the rebate. So that's the reasoning behind it. So the fact that the minister hasn't done that simply means that citizens then have to manage and navigate their way through the effects of inflation. And that simply means that whatever you could buy over the past year, your affordability levels have declined somewhat. And of course, there is a form of a tax because the minister had it within his discretion to be able to adjust that and support us as tax-paying citizens, but he's chosen not to do so. So therefore, we are worse off as citizens because he refused to apply his discretion.
Yeah, I remember Trevor Manuel, and every year during the growth years in South African economy, he would announce with great pride how we will adjust the tax brackets to the benefit of the taxpayer. Ray, there's something that I find curious, and that was the ministers in the motoring sector. They get 150% rebate on investment from 2026. I understand why it's from 2026 because I think it's a gradual progress to move from this internal combustion, I think, to electric motors or the hybrids. It'll be a gradual investment, so 2026 is not far off. But it sounds like a lot of money. And we already, a few years ago, my friend Mike Schuessler told me that we annually give around about a 60 billion rand rebate to the motor car industry. I understand the value of exports and foreign currency earnings and higher middle class jobs and employment and technology import. I understand all that. But that sounds like a lot of money. Do you think government buy into this philosophy of changing from internal combustion to electric motors?
Well, first of all, the world has already moved forward and is miles ahead when it comes to the rollout of electric vehicles and also baking in incentives for the manufacturing of local vehicles. We are way behind in South Africa, but I see this as a positive, Pete. It kind of indicates a shift in mindset by the government to really embrace, growing the electric vehicle market, whether South Africa has the capacity and whether South Africa, there is a market for electric vehicles, that's another question. But the fact that the government is moving in this direction and probing the feasibility of boosting the electric vehicle market, I think it's a good thing. But this is something South Africa should have done many, many years ago because we are miles behind, I think, as a nation when it comes to boosting manufacturing capacity, especially in the electric vehicle market. But I mean, already, even without this incentive in place, the large motoring companies, BMW, Toyota, are already moving ahead, with the production of, electric vehicles. From a policy perspective, there was a white paper as well too that outlined how South Africa plans to really support the EV market from a policy perspective. But you are starting to see the thinking coming through, especially from a policy level, on how to really manage this rollout and formalizing those incentives for manufacturers.
Tell me that one of the things that was the estimates has been lowered is the likely growth from 0.8 to 0.6 or something like that. On the back of what do you think the minister has lowered the growth expectations of the economy?
Well, it's two local and international factors. So the two big ones are Transnet, and the other one is Eskom and load shedding. That's wiping out a lot of tax revenue as well too. Globally, China is slowing down. So, and the reason why you're seeing a lot of the mining companies not being profitable at the moment, there is the question of Transnet, which is a big consideration, and Eskom as well. But China is slowing down, and the demand for precious group metals is lower. So it's a combination of both, but really a 0.8% growth, it's barely nothing to write about. It's barely any growth. It's not enough to lift, investments into the country, job creation, into the country. It's really woeful, to be honest.
Hey, what do you think will Moody's and the international ratings agencies, what do you think they will say? Because the markets have responded relatively positively. And by the way, the increase in the value of the rand is because what will happen is we will take the dollars and we will buy rands. And if you buy more of the rands, the value of the rand increases. So that is self-explanatory. But Kaya, what do you think? What else could the minister have done yesterday? That if you're the Minister of Finance, what else would you have done yesterday? And say, well, this can make a real change. And don't tell me you will have cut spending. We all know that's the obvious answer, but it can't be done. What creatively would you have done if you're the Minister of Finance yesterday to set South Africa on a different path?
So the first part is the reaction of the rating agencies would then be one that, again, that says, well, at least it's not getting worse in the medium term, in the sense that they're not going to borrow more and actually worsen an already fragile situation. So the expectation would be to say, well, that's a stable outlook rather than a worsening outlook. So that is the type of reaction that you expect from them. I think for me, the difficulty here is that it was a pre-election budget, and pre-election budgets always have to be treated with a much greater sense of skepticism, because what a minister would have had to do is to balance the question of, if I take difficult decisions and there's a political fallout, is that the type of political fallout that puts my government at the risk of not being returned to power? If this was 1999 and the ANC had a very comfortable majority, that conversation would be very different. The ANC does not have a comfortable majority. The question of potential political fallout would have loomed large in their own internal deliberations about what can be presented and what cannot be presented. What is also quite important is that, again, the 150 billion rand seems to be the easy solution to a much deeper problem of, well, if you do have this debt conundrum and cutting expenditure is not feasible because of the scale of what the state has to do, the only answer is to then tinker with the revenue side. So how much do you then ensure that the revenue side that you generate in the medium term and the long term is sufficient to cover whatever your debt exposure is at a particular point in time? And that for me is the missing element. So I didn't hear that by making this particular sacrifice, we're ensuring that the capacity of the economy to deliver the type of revenues and the type of taxes that are necessary to cover this particular gap is XYZ. And the other point is that when you talk about the 0.8 and the 0.6% being revised down, the reality is that whenever we have to listen to budgets, there's always a spectrum of possibilities. So there's a range of potential growth outcomes. And a minister and a politician will always go for the most optimistic one. And then later on, when reality intervenes and they say it's been revised down, well, it should have never been 1.6% or 0.8% to begin with. What is quite important is that whenever a minister says something like, when they say that growth is projected to move from 0.6% to 1.6%, that is almost a tripling of that particular rate. The simple question should be, what exactly is it that's going to be done differently that is so fundamentally different in nature, it gets us to move from either 0.6 or 0.8% to 1.6%. And unfortunately, we as citizens do not make enough of those interrogations, because I want to know what exactly they're going to do differently. And I'm also quite skeptical about a government that discovers, like you and I, what the electricity grid does on any particular day. How do they actually factor in that particular energy crisis into their growth projections? Because we now know that there's not a single person in this country who knows what's going to happen to Eskom tomorrow. There's not a single person in this country who knows when Transnet is going to turn its fortunes around. So in the absence of somebody having an anchor on these pillars and saying we're doing this in order to achieve those outcomes, all the numbers are very nice speculation that will eventually get revised down and reality intervenes.
Kaya, have you seen anything in the budget other than the investment of the rebate of the motoring sector? Have you seen anything, Kaya, in the budget that reminds you of the likeliness that could be identified possible growth point as far as government is concerned?
Sure. There's not much. And I think, obviously, some of the reforms that the minister mentions, again, it's a difficult one, because just because he said it in words doesn't mean that it's going to be reality. But when we talk about some of the changes that are being proposed in relation to how we are running state-owned enterprises in order to make sure that they're more commercially viable, depending on what their mandate is, that in theory, is something that is positive because it says that we actually are doing the right things in order to be able to get things to be better in the long run. We are paying the school fees now in order to be able to graduate into a better economy in the future. So he's free to put that in the speech, but in the absence of us seeing what the timelines and the reference points are, then it still remains quite hollow. It was also quite surprising that, again, the big ghost in the budget was Transnet. Now, you and I don't have to like it, but Transnet and Eskom are remarkably important. Transnet and Eskom are the nucleus of the economy. So they are state enterprises that are far too important to be allowed to fail. So you cannot keep deferring the question of what's going to be done with them to some future deliberations that happen away from the public arena, from the public discourse, because we do not know if the board of Transnet is sitting together today and say, well, in the aftermath of this budget, this is what we need to do in order to be able to meet whatever guidelines the minister wants, so that we'll be able to give in the finances that are necessary in order to turn this around. So the fact that it's in the budget, the fact that it's in words, it's in black and white, we now know through painful experiences over the past decade that that doesn't mean it actually will translate into tangible actions.
But, Ray, the minister actually took away the subsidy of the solar panels. And we now know that if you take, for instance, Kuburg, it produces around about 1,800 megawatt of power. South Africans, the private sector, households, businesses, farms, mines, have built 4,600 megawatt of power in the last 18 months. Why would the minister take this benefit, this encouragement, this incentive? Why would he take that away? Because it seems like if we can build 2 Kuburgs by the private sector in 18 months, that's something that we should have invested in.
Yeah, I don't know. It beggars belief because, I mean, last year, there was just an explosion of renewable energy for own use, especially by industry and individuals. I don't know why that solar panel incentive, was not extended. I see Kyle wants to venture out into an answer here.
He knows, yeah.
Ray, I'll answer for you.
Yes, Ray, finish your point.
I don't know. It just goes to, I don't know. There's so much indecisiveness, I guess, around, these policy decisions. You can either look at, the solar panel, incentive. You can look at the social distress of relief grant. At one point we were talking about a universal basic, income grant, which again, there's no decision on that. But I'll defer to Kaya on this one. Hey.
Oh yeah.
So in relation to that one, I actually interrogated National Treasury last year when they were putting it together to ask why exactly it was a one-year time frame, because I was just baffled as anyone else. But what the answer is that it's a combination of 2 problems. The first one is the financial implications problem, and the second one is actually the energy implications problem. When it came to the financial implications problem, Treasury is always hesitant to put together incentives that can only be accessed by the elite parts of society. And when they said that, it simply meant that if you look at the cost of putting these things together and the type of incentive that they're putting together, it simply meant that those with an income, those with discretionary income would be in a position to participate in this. So obviously, when you are in a state that like South Africa, where obviously the social economic fundamentals are as they are, it is always very difficult, even for Treasury itself, to justify putting together any form of intervention that essentially seems to disproportionately benefit the rich. So that was the financial implications dimension that they explained. The secondary implication was the fact that the reality is that even though there's been an explosion of people like you and I being able to buy these particular resources, it hasn't done much to actually address the underlying fundamental problem of Eskom's capacity to electrify the country at large. So the problem here is that until Eskom is fixed, and Eskom is the one that will still provide electricity to my grandmother, that will still provide electricity to a farm in a remote location, to people who don't have the capacity to participate in this incentive scheme. So if that is actually not being addressed, then this incentive scheme is indeed basically a gift for the elite. And that is why they actually walk back on the idea of extending it for a long time. They said it should have been a window period, a small window.
I allow the rich people to generate their own electricity. Then there's more that Eskom can provide to the poor people. It doesn't make sense to say, well, it just benefits, it actually do benefit the poor.
Well, precisely the problem is that Eskom hasn't then said, because 10,000 more people have decided to start generating their own electricity, or 10,000 more businesses have started generating their own electricity, this is now translating to less severe load shedding. In fact, because Eskom is so impossible to understand, government cannot actually draw a linear curve between saying we put this incentive together, so many people benefited, and Eskom's capacity to provide electricity was improved by XYZ, so therefore this is the best social outcome. So the crux of the problem is Eskom's inability to come up to come to the game and say, because you've enabled us to focus on fixing ourselves, therefore this is why it's better for society at large. So if Eskom did a better job of saying, actually this incentive is useful because it gives us better capacity to deliver to everyone else, then we must maintain it. So until that gets done, Treasury is going to struggle to sell this idea of actually extending the incentives. That was the explanation last year.
And with that piece of inside info, Kaya Sitori, thank you very, very much for being a participant in our very first Pitso this year. Raymond Clarkup, I should have met you earlier. Lovely, lovely mind. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you for participating and being so generous with your time. Much appreciated. To the Friends of the Business School who attended today, thank you very much. And then, of course, to Marley Moelman, who is doing the work in the background and putting everything together, and the Business School, who encourage this type of conversations. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon again. Thank you and goodbye.